Today in the EU, Europe's industry declines as China de-risks from the West. China's drive to reduce reliance on the West is worsening Europe's industrial decline. Beijing's push to achieve greater strategic independence from the West comes amid rising tensions between China and the West, while Europe is also pushing for independence from China. Hello and welcome. I am Evi Chiori and this is Today in the EU. To understand better how this is affecting Europe's industry, we talked with Thomas Moller Nielsen, Euractiv's economy reporter. Thomas, you've been writing a lot in the past months about fears of industrial decline in Europe, but what exactly do you mean by that?
You can understand it according to various metrics. So one is in terms of industrial output. So industrial production has fallen year on year by 5.7% relative to January the previous year. So in terms of overall industrial production, that's down. Manufacturing jobs have also declined across Europe after the last several years. So the European Trade Union Confederation, which represents around 45 million European workers, published a study recently where they estimated that nearly 1 million manufacturing jobs have been lost in Europe over the last 4 years.
That is a lot.
Yeah, it is. Factories are also closing. A lot of companies are moving to America to take advantage of cheaper energy prices, but also this Inflation Reduction Act, which is basically this massive industrial subsidy program that the US is providing to green companies, basically. And also they're moving to China also to take advantage mostly of lower energy prices there. Basically, however way you want to look at it, Europe is really facing some serious industrial problems.
And you've been talking to many representatives from big industries, but also many trade unions. What do they say about this?
Well, it's kind of interesting because you would tend to think that company bosses and unions would have very different perspectives. But here they agree. They say there's a real problem. So last week, the head of BASF, a guy called Martin Brudermüller, he was saying, look, Europe's industry is going to decline permanently. And the reason for that is high energy prices, which although they've fallen quite significantly since last year, they still remain structurally much higher than they were prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. BASF in particular, which is the largest chemicals company in the world, is a very interesting example of this. So they have a industrial headquarters in a place called Ludwigshafen, which is near Mannheim, where my younger brother lives actually. And they have cut jobs there, thousands of jobs. And at the same time, they are building this massive industrial facility in Guangdong in southeast China. It costs 10 billion euros, I think. It's the largest ever investment that the company has made. And the company is more than 150 years old, or maybe even 180 years old.
Cheaper labor, no?
Obviously, labor is cheaper there and there are other things. But the precipitating factor, so to speak, is high energy prices.
And do you think that EU regulations are a factor as well? Is Europe too regulated?
So this is actually where unions and companies disagree. Brudermüller said at this event, we basically need to cut regulations in Europe, and that's what's kind of holding back investment. Unions obviously don't like that because they think that's basically a sign that workers' rights are going to be restricted. My interpretation of what's going on really is that companies are in a very strong negotiating position. If they want to, they can go to China, they can go to America, and so they're calling for what they always want to call for, which is fewer regulations. So I wouldn't say that that's the root cause of the decline. As Brudermüller himself says, it's high energy prices.
And since we already mentioned China, you said that one of the elements that could be worsening the situation is China's goal to achieve greater independence from the EU. Why is that?
The obvious question you have to understand is, well, why is China doing this? They're worried that they might be unable to maintain the kinds of trade relations that they've been maintaining with particularly countries like Germany and the United States over the last few decades. So they're trying to seek greater strategic independence. I think that's perfectly understandable.
And Europe in general, how is it impacted?
There are two ways, really. So one is China is producing the kinds of machinery that ordinarily it would buy from European or American countries. So that's affecting the German economy in particular. But the other way is called overcapacity or oversupply or overproduction. The fact is they're producing so many, for instance, solar panels. Europe just can't compete, and that's depressing global prices. There's just this massive oversupply of very, very cheap goods. So Europe is very, very worried about it. They're critical of the policies that China is pursuing. But at the same time, I think we have to understand that what China is doing is perfectly understandable and I would argue probably inevitable.
And the other term that we're hearing a lot about is de-risking. What is it exactly?
Well, it's supposed to be different from decoupling.
What is decoupling then?
One way to understand it is Europe has decoupled from Russia over the last year and a half in certain senses. Sort of massive cuts in imports or exports over a short period of time. That's not really what Europe is trying to do with China.
Europe is open to competition, but not for a race to the bottom. We must defend ourselves against unfair practices. But equally, it is vital to keep open lines of communication and dialogue with China, because there are also topics where we can and have to cooperate. De-risk, not decouple. This will be my approach with the Chinese leadership at the EU-China summit later this year.
Said Ursula von der Leyen on the de-risking strategy during her latest State of the Union address.
What they mean by de-risking is limiting exports to China for certain particularly high-tech products or products with a possible military application, and also limiting Europe's dependence on China for certain critical materials, strategic raw materials as they call them.
They're trying to be independent.
So it's an attempt to reduce Europe's economic dependence on China across very specific strategic sectors, as opposed to kind of a reduction of dependence across the board.
And maybe this is causing some tension between China and the EU. Their relations have been a bit tense anyway. In what ways do you see this power play affecting our lives, if it does at all?
Well, yeah, I think it does affect everyday lives. I mean, so for instance, those workers at BASF have been made redundant. They don't work there anymore. Perhaps some of them have been moved to China, but the fact is those jobs have been cut and they're not going to be working there anymore. So it affects people in a very direct way.
We have consistently called for peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, and we stand strongly against any unilateral change of the status quo, in particular by the use of force.
Mentioned Ursula von der Leyen during her opening statements on Taiwan at a debate at the Parliament on the need for a coherent strategy for EU-China relations.
Obviously, the worst way it could affect our lives is if there's a full-scale war. Most people I've spoken to say that, well, the precipitating factor here would be a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. I hope that doesn't happen.
And how are businesses perceiving this?
Businesses are certainly very angry that the EU is basically attempting to enforce these export restrictions. They want to be able to basically do whatever they want. If you ever read Foreign Affairs, which is the main American, establishment journal, there's always been this deep tension there with regard to China. So on the one hand, you have members of the business community who want to trade with China and have good economic ties with them because they want to export to China, but China also has a rising... they want to import stuff from China, obviously, but at the same time, China has a rising middle class, and they want to export stuff there as well. But at the same time, you have the kind of military security establishment that's very cautious about this, and in fact, they're worried that by increasing economic ties, China is becoming, more of a military threat.
And has this debate moved from the US to Europe as well?
I see a sort of similar thing happening now in Europe. You see this kind of conflict between members of the business community on the one hand and members of the security establishment on the other hand. So when it came to Russia, for instance, the security establishment there basically said, no, importing from Russia poses a security threat. And when it comes to China, there's a similar debate going on. If it ever reaches a sort of a boiling point, I would imagine that the security establishment would again win the day. That's what usually happens, I think, if you look at examples across history.
And would you say that representatives of the industries will take some action against this, or are they just accepting this and are now at the phase where they're looking to move their companies elsewhere?
They're certainly not on the acceptance phase, and they do have a lot of negotiating power. Right now, they still have that ability to move production offshore. In terms of the regulations that the EU could impose to prohibit that, that would be... right now, Europe is limiting itself to imposing limits on foreign direct investment abroad and also export controls. Whether they would straightforwardly prohibit companies like BASF from moving production completely offshore is not something that I think is on the agenda right now. Just the negotiating position of businesses in Europe is quite strong. Labor in general is not in a particularly strong negotiating position. In fact, I did another article on this about how workers' wages have really declined over the last couple of years. They're not doing particularly well. I think whatever European policymakers end up doing, it's not going to be something that will be completely at odds with the wishes of the business community.
And what should we keep in mind when it comes to this topic?
I think the one thing that is worth keeping in mind is the fact that the policies that China is pursuing, their development model really has been absolutely remarkable over the last few decades. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of millions of people have been drawn out of poverty. China manufactures more than I think it's the next 7 or 8 countries combined. It's really an economic powerhouse, and that's something that's really quite remarkable. And our criticisms of China, it's often criticized for pursuing a kind of neo-mercantilist policy, which is basically exporting what it wants to export and only importing really what it wants to import, and not being committed to the principles of free trade, so to speak. That kind of development model is one that we in the West, speaking very broadly, because all these countries are developed in very different ways, but that's the kind of development model that Western countries also followed, again, in very broad terms. There's a fantastic book by Ha-Jun Chang called Bad Samaritans, where he talks about the fact that Britain and the United States, when they were developing and becoming industrialized economies, they were highly protectionist. The United States was the most highly protectionist country in the world until the end of the Second World War. And it was only when it achieved this position of kind of economic dominance that it kicked away the ladder, so to speak, and started really supporting free trade policies. And so the policies that China is pursuing are, I would say, understandable, although obviously they do in many ways conflict with the principles of free trade. So I think it's something that we in Europe should try to be a bit more understanding of the sorts of policies China is pursuing. I'm not trying to defend them, but if China is looking out at the world and it's seeing the kind of rhetoric that you see, again, particularly in the United States, where it's very kind of almost virulently anti-China, where they're trying to ban TikTok and things like that, and trying to stop China getting access to advanced computer chips and so on and so forth, it would probably be a little bit crazy for China not to pursue technological and economic sovereignty in the way it's pursuing.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for joining me today. I am Evi Chiori, and this was Euractiv's Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. This episode was produced by myself, Miriam Saez de Tejada, and Nicoleta Yonta. Thank you for tuning in, and we will be back on Tuesday. Until then, enjoy the short Easter break. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.